Up to this point in the course, we learned how to work with URLs and views, and we built this basic website here, which arguably is not very pretty. Now, we're going to change the look of this page in this module so that it does look better, but there's also one other thing which I would like to change because it's not really realistic right now, not really how we would build this in a bigger web application. If we have a look at our code and there at the views specifically, then we are returning some HTML code in some of these views, in some of these view functions. For example, here for the index view, where we render this list of months here, there we construct a long string consisting of li and anchor tag items wrapped in an unordered list, and that's then the data we return. And that is HTML code, which is interpreted as such by the browser, and which then leads to this list being output here. Now, if we leave the styling problem aside, we get a couple of other issues with that. For example, if we inspect that page source, what we'll see is that we got some HTML content here, but actually that is not really a well-structured HTML document. It's missing some key elements and some key features HTML documents should have, for example, to be optimized for search engines. In addition, the code we have here in our Django application is also not great. Constructing complex HTML documents or complex HTML code like this is not really how you would do it. This is not a complex document, but imagine if it would be. Imagine if you would want to create an entire page, let's say for a shop, with multiple products, with a navigation, with a footer, with all of that. Doing that in Python code like this would not be any fun. And the same, of course, is true for the other view where we construct HTML code. Here it's even simpler, but still, we don't really want to create our HTML code for the website in strings like this. Instead, it would be better if we had standalone HTML files which we can send back with the responses, but these files would need to be dynamic, so that we can, for example, inject our challenge text or inject our individual months which we want to output in this list here. So we need dynamic HTML files. And that's exactly what this course section will be about. It will be about working with so-called templates, which are such dynamic HTML files, and it will also be about static files, which we can add to our website. And we're going to have a look at these two features, how we can combine them and how we can use them. For that, we will first of all understand what exactly templates are and how they work in a Django website, in a Django project. We're going to take a closer look at the Django template language and the features it offers, because that will help us output dynamic content in HTML files. And last but not least, we're going to make our site a bit prettier by adding static files like CSS, but we could also add JavaScript or images with the technique I'll show you throughout this course section. So again, plenty of content to cover. Let's not waste any time and let's dive right in. So back in our project here, I now wanna work with those so-called templates. And just to make this clear again, templates will simply be HTML files which hold HTML code, which can also output some dynamic content. So which can, for example, render such a dynamically generated list, but will move the code from creating that list and from creating these HTML tags out of the views.py file into a HTML document. And for that, we'll need an HTML document. So therefore, we want to create a new HTML file, and the question now is where to create it. And the convention here is to go to your app folder, so in your project folder, into your app folder, in this case, challenges, and create a new subfolder in there. And you should name this subfolder templates. In that templates folder, you then create another subfolder, which you then again give the name of your app folder. So in this case, challenges. This might look weird, but this is a convention in Django projects, and it exists for a reason, to which I'll come back in a second. So now we have the templates folder in the challenges folder in our project folder, and inside of templates, we got the challenges folder. Now, inside of that challenges folder, we can now create our templates, our HTML files. So in here, I will create a new file, not a new folder, but a new file inside of the challenges folder. And I will name that file here challenge.html because I want to start with the template for an individual challenge. So for this view where we output the text for a specific challenge. So now we got this challenge HTML file in that challenges folder in that templates folder. Here in Visual Studio Code, it is basically displaying this as one path, since challenges is the only folder in templates. But this challenges folder is a nested folder in templates, and this challenges folder then holds this challenge HTML file. Now, this challenge HTML file will hold the regular HTML document structure we would expect from such a file. And in Visual Studio Code, we can quickly scaffold, which basically means automatically create that structure by typing HTML here in that HTML file. And you should then get these auto suggestions here. And if you select the HTML5 suggestion and hit enter, you get that default skeleton, this default HTML document skeleton created automatically. It contains the doc type, the HTML wrapper, and then a head section and an empty body section. Now in the head section, we can add a title, and we could name this monthly challenge, whatever you want. And then the body, we can now, well, set the body of our document. And for a start here, I'll add a h1 tag where I want to say this month's challenge, and then maybe in a h2 tag, go for a walk for at least 20 minutes every day. Now, at the moment, this is all hard-coded, but that's just there to get started. So now we can save this file and we got our first HTML document. Now we might want to send this HTML document back to the client, so to the visitor of our website, when this view function here is triggered, so as part of our HTTP response. Now how can we send back this HTML file to the client? Well, we still want to send back a HTTP response, and to this response, we can't really pass just the file. Instead, what we want to do here is we want to basically read that file, extract the HTML content, and store that in a string, which is then sent back with the response. So we want to transform that file to a string, which then basically holds the content of the file. And for this, Django has a function which we can import and use. From Django template loader, we can import the render to string function. And this will do what the name implies. It renders something to a string. It converts something to a string. Now with this import added in the monthly challenge view function down there, we can set our response data equal to render to string. And now here, the first argument which this function wants is actually the name of our template file, so of our HTML file. So here we could pass in challenge.html like this, but this alone wouldn't work. We actually need to use challenges/challenge.html. And I'll come back to why we need that and why we placed that file in that subfolder in just a second. Now what this will do is it will read that HTML file, transform the content to a string, and then store that string in response data. And we're then still passing response data with the HTTP response back to the client. Now that's the first step. If you now save everything and go back to your running dev server, and you click on a month, you now get the month is not supported. Now we're actually getting this because it looks like somewhere in these 3 lines an error occurs, which we catch, and hence we send back that not found response. If we temporarily comment out try except to see that error, and we save that file, and we reload this page here, we see the actual error. And that's the error that the template does not exist. It's basically failing to find that challenges challenge HTML file. Now, why is it failing? Well, if you scroll down a bit, it actually tells you where it tried to load the template from, so where it looked for the files. And it tells you that it looked in some admin folder. That's not a folder we're managing, so it can't find it there. And it looked in some auth folder, which is also not a folder we're owning. So it basically didn't look for that template HTML file in our templates folder in the app folder. And there's a reason for that. Remember the settings py file in monthly challenges? So in that subfolder which holds our project name? In there, you can configure key settings about this Django project. And up to this point, we didn't need to touch it. But if we have a look at this folder now, we'll notice something interesting. There is a templates setting. And this is a list of dictionaries. And here we got some options regarding templates. For example, we got an option to configure how Django should parse and handle templates. And we definitely want to keep the default here. Then we got further processing options, but here the defaults are fine as well. But what's interesting are these 2 options, DIRs and AppDIRs. DIRs is an empty list and AppDIRs is true. Now with DIRs, here you could add paths to directories in your project folder that should be considered by Django. So here you could add directories where you want to store templates which Django should consider. So we could add our challenges templates folder here. Now for this, it is important to know that the path we want to specify here actually should be an absolute path. And therefore, in this settings py file, we actually got the base dir helper variable, which gives us the path to this overall project folder. So we can build up subpaths based on that base dir as a starting directory, so that we don't need to start at the operating system level and build the path to this project folder in our on our computer, but that we can start from the project folder level. So what we could do here is we could go to dirs and then reference base dir, and then add something to this path, which we can do with this slash here in Python as well. And here we could then add challenges, so point at our challenges folder, and add templates. And by adding this, we're telling Django that in our project folder, that's what we point at with base dir, we'll have templates in a challenges folder and they're in the templates folder. So that Django should look in this path as well when it's looking for templates. I don't add the nested challenges folder in the templates folder to this setting here because I'm referencing my template here in the view such that I do tell Django that there will be a challenges folder in which this challenges HTML file sits. If we now save that and reload this page, this template is loaded correctly. And that means that we now can also bring back that error handling here. But that is actually not the best way of making Django aware of our template here. There is a better way, because at the moment we would have to basically change dirs whenever we add a new app to our project. And whilst we might not be doing that too often, this is such a common case that this kind of support for looking for templates in an app folder is actually built into Django with that second setting here, the AppDirs setting. Therefore, I'll comment out this part here in dirs, so that this is again an empty list. And instead we want to utilize this setting, which actually is already true by default. This setting tells Django that it wants to look for templates in the app folders. So it will automatically look for templates folders in app folders. Except for that it didn't seem to be doing that, right? It failed to find our template. The reason for that is simple. We know that we have this app, but Django isn't fully aware of it. Yes, there is this challenges subfolder, but that alone is not enough. If you have an app that should be part of the overall project, and you want to use features like this template detection, you need to officially register your app with that project, you could say. And up to this point, we haven't done this yet. Now, how do you officially register your app? There's another setting in that settings.py file. If you scroll up a bit, you'll find the installed apps list here. Now, there already are a couple of apps installed, which are basically all built-in apps, built-in features Django ships with. As a side note, this again emphasizes what I told you earlier in the course, that apps don't have to be big standalone products, but that you can look at apps as modules of a project. There is an admin module, an auth module, a module for managing sessions, and these are all modules which we haven't really used up to this point. Except for content types, we used this indirectly because that's actually a module which is built into Django, which is responsible for detecting when you're sending back HTML and for setting the correct headers on the response. But what we want to do now is we want to add our own app here. And we do this by adding a string. And since the rest of this file uses single quotes and I don't want to change them all, I will also use single quotes here. You could, of course, also use double quotes. But we want to add a string here. And we simply want to use our app name here. Challenges, because that's our folder name, and also the name we have here in that apps.py file in the challenges app folder. There, the app name is basically set to challenges. That's why we want to add challenges here to installed apps just like this. And what this does now is it makes Django aware of our app, officially aware. And now, for example, for features like template detection, Django will look into our app folder and it will look for a templates folder there. And therefore, this name also isn't up to you. This has to be named templates. And now if I save that with our app added to installed apps and appders still set to true, if we now reload for April, this still works. And remember that earlier it failed. It still works because we're now successfully using this appders feature. And that's the best way of making Django aware of your app-specific templates. Now, if you would have some other template folder outside of your app, so some global templates which are used by multiple apps, for example, then you could add this folder to DIRs as we did it earlier. But for your app-specific templates, I strongly encourage you to utilize this built-in appders feature because that simply is the best practice way of doing it, and it also keeps your settings leaner and doesn't require you to add all those DIRs to the DIRs list here. Now that we know how to add templates and how to render templates, I want to come back to why we actually pointed at challenges/challenge HTML. Why did I not place that HTML file directly in the templates folder instead of the nested challenges folder in there? We could have placed it in there. We could have skipped that extra challenges folder. We then would have to adjust this path here as well. But it is considered a best practice to repeat your app name in the templates folder, because if you have multiple apps in your project, and these different apps might have similar template names, if you would have just a template named challenge HTML directly in the templates folder for the challenges app, if you then had another app which also has a challenge HTML file in its template folder, Django would not be able to tell these two templates apart. they have the same file name, and Django essentially just merges all template folders from all apps into one big template folder under the hood, you could say. And therefore, you would have similar file names for different apps, and Django would not be able to tell them apart. That's why it's a best practice to repeat the app name in the templates folder instead of the app folder. This is simply required to ensure that you never accidentally have clashing template file names across different apps. So that's something which matters. Now, besides that, there's one other thing I want to highlight here and which I actually want to improve. Currently, we're calling render_to_string to convert the template to a string. And then we send back that string as part of the HTTP response. There is nothing wrong with it, but this is such a common pattern that Django actually has a shortcut for that. And we're actually already importing that shortcut function by default here. If not, make sure you add this import to your views.py file where you import the render function from django.shortcuts. This render function can be used to replace render_to_string and sending back that response. So with it, we can get rid of the render_to_string import here and go down to this view function. And instead of having these two lines, we can actually just return render. So we return the result of calling render, and to render we pass that string, and that's it. So we can get rid of these two lines now, and that's simply a bit shorter and does the same thing as before. The only difference here is that we need to add a first argument in front of that template name, and that should be that request which we received. Up to this point, we haven't done much with that request, but the render function actually needs it, so that internally it can extract data from there. So if you use render, you must pass the request to it, and then as a second argument, that template path. And with that, if we save that, we can reload that April month, and of course we can also go back to the other months, and this all works. And we now successfully load that challenge. So that's all good. We now learned in depth how the templates generally work and how we can load them, how we make Django aware of them. But up to this point, these templates are not dynamic at all. Or this single template we have is not dynamic at all. It only contains hard-coded, static HTML code. And that's typically not what we want. Instead, typically, we want to have some hard-coded HTML code in there, but then we also have dynamic pieces. For example, we might want to output the name of the month and also the goal of the month. So therefore, that's what we're going to learn about next. Django has this built-in template feature, and for those templates, it has its own templating language, the Django Template Language, or DTL. The idea is simple. You want to create HTML files, which you then can enhance to actually create dynamic pages, which are being sent back to the client on the fly on the server. So the idea is that we have standard HTML syntax, as we saw it thus far, combined with this special Django template language to dynamically inject values or dynamically create HTML elements inside of this HTML file so that we then can send back a customized dynamic response to the client. And we therefore have a dynamic HTML page as a result, which is returned with the response. Now, up to this point, we only have a static HTML page. But now let's say we want to output this challenge text for the chosen month dynamically. Because of course we do have different texts for the different months. And we already are getting the text here in challenge text, we're just not using it at the moment. Well, now we can leverage the Django template language to set this text dynamically in our template. And for this, we first of all need to pass a third argument to the render function. As a side note, if we would still be using the render_to_string function from before, there it would be the second argument. But here we're using render, and here it's the third argument. This argument should be a dictionary, so opening and closing curly braces. And in this dictionary, we can now set up key value pairs, and these key value pairs will be exposed as variables inside of that template file. And you will see how we can use them there in just a second. So here I want to add a key now of, let's say, text. The key name is totally up to you. And as a value, I want to set challenge text. So what we have stored in this variable is now set as a value for this text key in this dictionary. That's step number 1. The second step now is to use this key value pair inside of the template file. And for that, there you can use a special syntax, which is not regular HTML, but which will be picked up by Django, since Django is parsing and evaluating your template files. Here you can use double curly braces opening and closing, which is a special syntax that will be picked up by Django, to basically inject dynamic content in this place. So this is like a placeholder which will be replaced by Django when it parses this template. And here we can now point at the keys in this dictionary which we pass to render. This dictionary is the so-called context for this template or for rendering this template. And there I have a text key. So now we can reference this text key here to output the value stored in this text key. So in this case, the value stored in challenge text in this place. So Django will swap this code here for the concrete value stored in this text key, so this challenge text in this place here, when it renders this template. So if we save that, and I now reload my June challenge, you see that text changed. It's now the text for June. Learn Django for at least 20 minutes every day. That is our June text here. Now, if you inspect that source code here in the browser, you will see that there, this looks like hard-coded text, because Django analyzes and replaces those curly braces on the server and then generates a final HTML file or a final HTML string, which it does send back to the client, to the browser. So the browser only receives that finished HTML code. There you don't see that Django template language. You don't see that placeholder because it was replaced on the server already. But this is one of the key features of the Django templating language, being able to inject dynamic values like this. And therefore, now I got a challenge for you. As a next step, I want you to replace this title and also this h1 tag with another dynamically injected value where you actually say April challenge or June challenge. So where you output the concrete month name for which you're displaying the challenge. This is my challenge for you. This is my task for you, a little exercise. In the next lecture, we're going to implement it together. Were you successful? Let's implement this together. So for this, we need to start in the views.py file. There we currently only get the challenge text. Now we also need to get the month name. Well, actually, we already do get the month name here with month. But we also might want to capitalize it. And therefore, what I'll do is I'll add a month name key here to my context to expose this month name variable in the template. But as a value, I'll set month.capitalize to transform this month string, which it is, to a string which starts with a capital character. We did this earlier as well. I already did call capitalize here, and now I'm just doing this again. So now we'll have this month name variable available in the template, and therefore here we could say month name challenge. Challenge is still hard-coded, but I inject the concrete value for the month name. We can do the same here in the title. You're not limited to using this injection feature, which officially is named Interpolation, only in the body. You can use it anywhere in your HTML document. So therefore now if I save this, if I reload, we see June challenge here. We see June challenge in the tab title here. And therefore this now works. And that's already all. We're just using what we did before in different places of this document, and also with an extra value which we slightly change here before we hand it off to the template. So now we learned about outputting these variables with interpolation in our templates. And in the last exercise, we actually added this month name, which I capitalized here. There is absolutely nothing wrong with doing that here in the view. But for such formatting logic, where it's really just about changing how it looks, so just about the way it's displayed, we could argue that we want to do as much of that logic as possible inside of the template instead of inside of the view. So that we don't want to call capitalize here, but would like to do that in the template. Now, one thing which we can't do is we can't call capitalize here. You can't execute Python code like this here. You can point at these variables, so at these keys which you get through the context, these keys here, but you can't run any extra Python logic here then. There will be some logic which we can add, which we'll see soon, but you're always limited to the features offered by that DTL, that Django templating language. But this template language has a lot of built-in features. For example, it has features called tags and filters. And if you search for Django template filters, you're directly taken to the official Django documentation for those tags and filters. Now we're going to have a look at tags in just a second. For the moment, I want to focus on filters. And there, if I scroll on the right side, we can go to the built-in filter reference. Filters are basically adjustments or little transformations we can apply to values which we're outputting with interpolation. For example, there is an add filter, which we can run on some value which we're outputting with these double curly braces. And this allows us to add a value. Now, there also is a title filter, which you apply like this. You always apply filters by adding a pipe symbol after the value you're outputting. So after that variable name, that key name you're outputting, you add a pipe symbol and then the filter name. And you're limited to the supported filters like those built-in filters here. You can also build your own filters, but that's beyond the scope for now. And there are a lot of built-in filters, which you of course can also browse and play around with. Now, the title filter does exactly what we're looking for here, though. We can apply it here. And what the title filter does is it will capitalize this word and turn the first character to an uppercase character. So by adding a pipe here and then title, we're applying that title filter. So now if we save that and reload, we see June is again capitalized here. Not in my browser tab title though, because there I'm not applying that filter yet, but of course we can apply it there as well. So if I add the title filter there as well, and I reload, you will see that now June is uppercase there again as well. So that is just an alternative to using capitalize in the view. If you want to use it or not, also comes down to your personal preference, but it is definitely not a bad practice to use these filters and to do these visual transformations in the template instead of the view. On the other hand, it's also not horrible if you do it in the view, but generally you want to limit the work you do in the view and really restrict it to your core business logic, which might be needed for fetching and transforming the data. And when it comes to formatting and outputting the data, you might want to do as much of that logic in the template. And filters are a great tool for that. So now we had a first look at some of the most important template features you have in Django. Now, before we dig deeper into the Django template language, and there will be more to have a look at, before we do that, I want to make our life a bit easier when it comes to working in these HTML files. You might have noticed that we get no autocompletion there really, and that this special syntax is not really detected. Instead, the editor, Visual Studio Code, currently treats all that special DTL syntax as plain text. Which means that if I have a typo here, like tl, or if I forget one of the curly braces or anything like that, I'm not getting any warning here. I'm not seeing that here. We'll just get an error if we then try to run this. Now, to get better support here, we can again have a look at the extensions and there search for Django. And you will find this Django extension here from Baptiste Darthenay, which you can install into your project. This extension will help you with Django development in general, but also especially with templates. Now here in the usage instructions, you then also learn how you can configure your project to make sure that this extension is able to help you with your project and with your templates as good as possible. To be precise, you can copy this snippet here and drop it into your VS Code settings JSON file, like this. This will ensure that for your HTML files, you get that best possible support by this extension. And indeed, if we now go back to the template, you see the look now changed. This is no longer treated as blank text. Instead, now this filter is highlighted, the pipe symbol is highlighted, and if I remove one of the curly braces, I now immediately see that this seems to be wrong because it's not getting that color coding anymore. It's all white, which now tells me that it's wrong because now we have this better syntax highlighting here. So therefore, I would recommend that you do add this extension simply to make your life as a developer a bit easier. Now that we learned about variables and filters in templates, it's time to move on. And next, I want to have a look at tags and lists and how we can use those features in templates. Now, tags are something you already heard about when I introduced you to filters. Tags are simply another syntax feature that's built into the DTL, the Django template language. And if you have a look at the official tag reference, you'll see that there are a lot of tags. Some tags will be used rarely, but there also are a lot of tags which you will use quite a bit. For example, the for tag. The for tag allows us to loop through content. And you can read all about it here, but of course I'll also show it to you in detail in this course. So we actually got a list already in our application, in our project here. In views.py, in the index function, we are creating that list of months here, this list. And currently we're creating that all here in the view without a template, which of course is not how we would want to do it. Therefore, as a first step, I'll add a new template file named index.html in that challenges folder in the templates folder. In that index.html file, I'll again create a standard skeleton. And thanks to the Django extension, this built-in skeleton creation doesn't seem to work anymore, but that's no problem. I can copy that from the challenge.html file, copy in the skeleton here, and I will now change the title to all challenges, hard-coded. And then the body, I want to output that list, so that unordered list. So we'll still have these unordered list tags here, but now inside of that unordered list, I want to generate these list items dynamically. And we can easily do that with that for tag. Now for that, we first of all need to go back to the view, and here in that index function, I now want to change what I return. Instead of returning that response data, which I generate like this here, I rather wanna return render and then pass request to render as you learned it, then specify the template which should be rendered, which is in the challenges subfolder, and then the index HTML file, and then pass in the context. Now, one side note about this path here, this now shows really well why we have that extra challenges subfolder in templates, because whilst it might have been unlikely that we have another template called challenge in some other templates folder in some other app, it's very likely that we might have more than one index HTML file across all the apps we might have in our project. That's why this extra challenges subfolder is that best practice I mentioned before. But that's just a side note. Back to this context. In this context, I now want to pass my list of months to the template so that it can be output there. Now we generate that list of months here, and I still want to do that here, so I'll pass my months key, the key name is up to you though, and set the value to that months list which I'm generating here. We can get rid of the list items variable because we don't need that anymore. Now with that, I'm passing that list of month names which we're generating to the template. And in the template, we can use that now. Here we want to generate all those list items with the anchor tag inside of them. So here we then also want to have those anchor tags with some link in the end, of course, also. And we want to generate one list item per month in our months list. So we need to loop through all the items in the template here. And that's exactly what we can do with that for block. A block in the DTL is created with curly braces as well, but not double curly braces, but instead single curly braces with a percentage sign. Then there you have your block name, like for, and you see that now the color also changed. And then you basically have that normal Python for loop syntax. So here we can then have for month in months. This name, month, is up to you. Months is only partially up to you because, of course, this should be the name you're setting as a key in your context. So here I'm setting months as a name for my context key for this dictionary here. And therefore, here we also want to refer to that months list to loop through it. Now, you also need to tell Django where this block ends. So which content should be repeated for all the months. Here I want to create one list item per month, but not one closing UL tag. And therefore, here we close that block with end for. And that's important. In Python, you use indentation to determine what belongs to a for loop or to an if statement or to a function. You use indentation for that. In the DTL, so in the templates, you don't use indentation. It does not matter how this is indented. You could write it like this and it would be fine as well. Instead, here you clearly need to mark the beginning and the end of a block with this beginning syntax in case of the for block and end for to close it. And this tells Django which content should be repeated for every month in your months list. Now Django then also gives you access to this month, which you store in a variable named month, for every iteration inside of that repeated content. So outside of that block, we can not use month. So trying to reference it here would fail because this month variable is only available inside of the block. But there we can use it. And therefore here we can again use the double curly braces to interpolate a value, so to create that placeholder, and then, for example, output month here like this. We also might want to capitalize this, and we can therefore use the title filter as we learned it. And with that, if we save this and reload, we again create that list, but now based on the template. And you can tell that this is the templates work if you click on one of the months, because currently this doesn't do anything because I haven't set that link location yet. But that's something we're also going to do in a second, of course. But that's now how we can use tags, another important feature, and how we especially can use the for tag, which is a super important feature which you need basically in all web projects you're going to build with Django, because it turns out that you typically have lists everywhere. Now with that, let's next focus on outputting that link location here. So how can we now tell the link where to go? Previously, when we constructed everything in the view, we used the reverse function for generating that link. Now this does not work here in the template. We can't use all those Python features there, only the DTL features. But one way of generating a dynamic link here would be to again use the double curly braces. This is possible here as well. You're not limited to using the double curly braces between opening and closing HTML tags only. You can really use it anywhere in your document, including here in the value of a HTML attribute. And that's why I'm starting with this approach, because I want to emphasize that you can use this interpolation syntax anywhere. Wherever you have something that should be generated dynamically, you can use this interpolation syntax. So here we could then, for example, hardcode /challenges/ and then here output month. So that is a hard-coded part of this value, of this attribute value, but then we also inject a dynamic segment here as part of this attribute value, so that the overall link location would be /challenges/ and then the month for this loop iteration. And if we save that and reload our template here, indeed, that would work. Now we have working links. But we face the same problem as mentioned earlier in the course when you hardcode links or paths like this. Whenever the URL changes, whenever we decide that we want to have challenge instead of challenges or anything like that, we need to change our paths everywhere in the application, including our templates. So it would be better if we could dynamically generate the path here. But as I mentioned, the reverse function is not available, also not inside of that double curly brace syntax. That won't work. But instead, there is another tag we can use. One which you of course also find in that official reference. There we will find that URL tag. And the URL tag is basically the equivalent to the reverse function, just inside of your templates. You use it as all tags with single curly braces and then percentage signs. And then here it's the URL tag. So you add URL here. Then you add the name of the URL to which you want to construct the path. So in my case, that is month-challenge. That's the name of this URL. So month-challenge it is. And we reference this here, though that should be between quotes. So we want to have quotes here. We can, of course, also use double quotes. And then we can add any arguments that might need to be appended. Unlike with reverse, we don't add a list here. We just add those arguments separated by whitespace. And we can see that here as well. We can also add keyword arguments to identify the arguments by the name we reserve for them in our URL setup. So here in this case, I have the month argument in this URL, and therefore we can either just add the value for that or identify that by name, which can especially be helpful if we have multiple dynamic segments. But here we only have one dynamic segment. So here we can now pass in month as a value. So this month variable here which we get in this loop, the value of that is now set as a first argument, a first dynamic segment value for the URL identified by this name. And if we had more dynamic segments, we would simply add those extra arguments here. Alternatively, as I mentioned, you can identify them by their name. So here we could have month equals month because we have month as a name here. So that is the part in front of the equal sign. And then the value also happens to be stored in a variable named month, which is why we have that. But that's a bit overkill here. We only have one dynamic segment, so we can just set that value, and therefore this will now be plugged in as a concrete value for this dynamic segment for this loop iteration. Again, that's really just what you see here in the official docs as well. And with that, if you save that template and you now reload this list of challenges, the links still work, but now they're generated in a better way using that URL tag. Now, unlike the for tag, this URL tag needs no closing tag. We needed end for the for loop. That's not the case here. And I guess that makes sense. Where the for loop was used to really repeat a chunk of HTML code and recreate that code all the time, the URL tag is really just used to create one specific URL and nothing else. So it doesn't really need a starting and an ending place because it does just that one single task. And with that, we can now also generate URLs dynamically in templates, which of course is another key feature. Now we made quite some progress. I again want to highlight something which I did highlight before, but which is super important. If you inspect your page source in the browser, again, you will only see the final result here. You don't see all those tags, the for tag, the URL tag, or the filters. You don't see anything of that here because all that DTL, that Django template language, is parsed and evaluated on the server. The client only receives the finished HTML document, the finished HTML code. This is really important, and therefore I wanted to emphasize it again. With that though, I now want to dive into another important tag, which we often need. And that's the if tag to output content conditionally. Let's say we actually don't have challenges for all months. Let's say for December we have no challenge. So in the views py file, I'll set the value here to none. There is no challenge for December. The key exists, but the challenge is not set. Now, in such a case, when we load December, we might not want to show none here. Instead, we might want to show some text like, there is no challenge for December yet, or you haven't set a December challenge yet. We might want to show some fallback text like this. And that, of course, is only true for months where we have no challenge. So we can't go to challenge HTML and add this challenge fallback text as a hard-coded text like this. We can't say there is no challenge for this month yet. Because whilst this would show up in December, it also would show up for all other months. And in addition, even for December, it's not optimal because we're still also showing none. So instead, we want to run some conditional logic in the template. And we either want to output this h2 tag or this paragraph here. And that's, of course, also something you can do with Django and with tags. In the official tag reference, you will see the if tag. And that if tag allows you to write if statements in your templates. It also allows you to write elif and else statements. And just like the for tag, you also need to end that if statement somewhere then, to tell Django where your if statement stops, because again, you don't use indentation for that in the templates, you use end if and end for instead. Now, as you see, The if syntax here works basically like it works in regular Python code. You can use and, or, and not. You can use the equality comparison operator and inequality, smaller than, greater than, smaller than or equal, greater than or equal, the in operator, not in operator, is. So basically what you know from regular Python, you can use that in your conditions in here as well. And therefore, let's now add that. For this, again, we have single curly braces with the percentage sign, and then it's the if tag, which I want to use here. And I want to check if we have a challenge for this month. Now, keep in mind that we can determine whether we have a challenge or not by having a look at our text key, because that holds the challenge text. And that challenge text is either really a text or it's none, because it is none for December, for example. So therefore, here we can check if text is not none, for example, and then we want to render this, else we want to render this paragraph. So next we can add percentage else, and then at the end we add percentage endif. And we can indent this for readability, but technically you don't need to indent it. You could also add an elif case if you needed that, but here we don't. Here, this should be enough. And this should make sure that we only render this text if it's not none, but if it is none, we render the fallback text. So if we now save this challenge template and we reload December, we only see the fallback text here. If, on the other hand, I go to a different month, I see the challenge text for this month. And that's exactly what we wanted here. So that's how we can use the if tag to render content conditionally. And that's another core tag you need to know when working with Django templates. We covered a lot of key features with templates up to this point. There are two other key features left here, which I definitely also want to cover. The first one is template inheritance. Here we have two templates. That is not a lot, but already we have some code duplication. The general structure is of course the same, the general document structure, and that will pretty much always be the case. All your HTML documents always have the same core structure. The doc type, the HTML wrapper, a head section, the body section, and it's then just the content in the body and also some content in the head which might differ. But you might want to define this core skeleton once, maybe also including some navigation or some footer which is always shared, and then just inject the parts which are different in your different templates into that core structure, that core template which you might want to define once. And that is exactly the idea behind template inheritance. For that, we could create a new folder in our project folder, so in the root project folder next to our two subfolders here, and we could name that folder templates. Now you don't have to create it here, but since this might be a template that is shared across all apps, you might not want to create your core structure in an app-specific template folder, but really on the entire project level. Now, again, this is up to you, not something you have to do, but definitely something you can consider doing. Now in here, we might have our base HTML file, or maybe a layout HTML. That name is up to you. I'll go with base. And in here, we then want to create that core structure, which I'll quickly copy from my index.html file. So I'll copy that in here. So this is the core structure, but of course the title should be dynamic and the body should also be dynamic, let's say. To make sure that that's the case, we can use another tag. We can use the block tag. For example, here in place of the title. Again, we have single curly braces with a percentage sign, and then the keyword block. This is another built-in tag Django supports in templates. This allows us to define a block which will later be able to inject content into. Now you can give this block any name of your choice, and you must give it a name. Here I'll use page title. But again, that's up to you. You also need to define an ending tag here, end block. Now there's nothing in between here. Whoops, I don't need that. It should look like this. There's nothing in between here, but you could actually set a default title, like my challenges, which would be used as a fallback if no content is passed in from the templates which will inherit from this template. And we're not doing that yet, so this might still be a bit abstract, but we'll see it in a second. Now you can have more than one block, and I will need more than one block. Here I also want to have a block in my body. So here I'll add block and name this content. Again, these names are up to you. And here I'll also add end block thereafter, and we could have some fallback content in between, or also leave that empty if you want to. And we can of course then also put this all into one line. So now we have this base HTML file with two blocks. Now we want to extend that file from our templates. So for example, from the index HTML file. We do that by going to the top of that HTML file. And that's important. You need to do this at the top. And there we add another tag, which is the extends tag. And here we now point at the template which we want to extend. I will go with base HTML here. Now you need to make sure that Django is able to find that template. For this, you can also specify relative paths here. For example, here we could go up one level with .. and this is relative from this index HTML file. So by going up one level, we would be in the templates folder. We could go up one level more and we would be in the challenges app folder. And we could go up one level more and we would be in the project folder. And then we could dive into templates, so into this templates folder here, and then access base HTML. But that's very cumbersome, and we always need to adjust this if we move this index HTML file around or if we move the base HTML file around. Therefore, I rather specify an absolute template name or path here, and I just want to make sure that Django picks up this path. And therefore, we can go to the settings.py file in our project subfolder again, and there in dirs, I'll again add base dir templates so that I make sure that Django also checks the templates folder in my overall project folder for templates, so that it dives into this templates folder here as well. And then if I have a base HTML file here and I reference a base HTML file here, this connection will be made by Django. Now, what does extends actually do though? Well, it does what the name kind of implies. It bases this template on the extended template. So that means that we can get rid of all that dummy structure here, also of the title tags here, which we already have in our base template. There I already have that base structure. I already have the title tags. But I want to get rid of that, also of the closing head and the opening body. And now instead, I just want to tell Django where to inject this content which is template specific, so which is specific for this index HTML file. And we do that with help of that block feature, that block tag, which I showed you before. We have two blocks in our base template, and that is this page title block and the content block. And we now tell Django to inject this title here into the title block by again using the block tag here. But now here, we again use the same name as we do in our base template, so page title here. And we also need a starting and an ending tag here to let Django know where the content that should be injected into the base template starts and ends. But with that, we now make sure that all challenges will be injected into the base template in the page title block, which happens to be inside of these title tags. That's where we have this block. And we do the same with the content block for the body tags. There, we want to wrap the unordered list now with block content, because I'm using content as a name in base HTML. And again, we want to mark where this block begins and ends, so we also need end block here. And we can indent, but we don't have to. Now I'll also move this all down a bit. And if I now save all of that, if I go back to my challenges list, this looks like before, but it's now based on that base template. And I can prove that it's based on that if I quickly insert a h1 tag here where I say all challenges in my base HTML file. So in that template from which my other templates inherit. If I do that and reload, you see all challenges here, which proves that I'm inheriting from that. Now I will remove that again, because of course I don't want to say that on every template I have in the entire app. I just wanted to add this temporarily to prove that inheritance works. Now we can also inherit with the challenge HTML file. And speaking of a challenge, this is again a good challenge and a good practice for you. So try inheriting from the base template with this challenge template on your own. In the next lecture, we're going to implement it together. Were you successful? Let's do this together. It isn't too difficult. In challenge HTML, we again want to start by extending. And that's always important. You need to extend. Otherwise, Django won't know on which template this template should be based. So here I'll again extend base HTML. And then again, we just want to keep what's dynamic. So we remove that here, but then wrap this code here into block page title, like this, and block. We remove this, but we then wrap this h1 tag and the if statement here into block content. And of course also end that block here. Like this. And that should already be all. If we now save that and we go to an individual month, that works as before, but now again, we're based on that base template. And you could have different base templates for inheriting. You just need to define from which one you want to inherit in a specific template with extends. But then you can have as many base templates as you want. There's nothing wrong with that. The last core template feature I want to dive in for now are includes or partials, as they are also sometimes called. With that, I'm referring to a related concept to template inheritance, but the idea now is not that we have a base template from which we inherit, but that we have snippets, HTML snippets, template snippets, which we might want to reuse in various templates, but which don't act as a base template with the entire structure that should be used by some other template. An example could be a navigation bar. At the moment, our little dummy application here, our dummy site, doesn't have any navigation. We just directly output an unordered list or the challenge title and text. Now, it might make sense to have a little navigation bar here at the top, which allows us to switch back to the all challenges list. Because at the moment, when we are on a specific month, we can only go back with the back button. So having a little navigation bar there might be nice. And that navigation bar could then also include other links, for example, to an About You page, if we had that as well. So what we can, of course, do is, in our content block here in challenge HTML, we could add a header opening and closing, so the default header HTML tag, and in there we could add the nav tag to add a navigation, and in there we could then have an anchor tag with a link to the all challenges page, which we'll have to construct in a second, where we say all challenges. That's something we might want to add. Now, we might want to add that not just to challenge HTML, but also to index HTML. Of course, here we already are on the all challenges page, but it is quite common for websites to have the same header on all pages, not just on one page. So therefore here we might want to add that header as well. And we can do that, but now we're duplicating code. Of course, we could outsource this header into our base template. We could add it here above the content block and then remove it from the individual templates. But if this would be a bigger project with multiple applications, maybe not all parts of the project share exactly the same header. Maybe there are tiny tweaks that need to be made, so therefore we might not want to add it to the base template. So hence I will go for an include here. And that simply means that I don't want to duplicate the code across templates, instead I'll remove it there. But I will create a new folder here in my challenges subfolder next to my template files, which I'll name includes. The name is up to you though. You could name that partials or shared or whatever you want, but I'll go for includes. And in includes, I'll add my header HTML file, though that file name is also up to you. In that file, however, I will add my header like this. And now I want to include this HTML snippet defined here in both the challenge HTML and the index HTML files. And we can do this with another tag offered by the Django template language. Here, inside of my content block, I will add a new tag, and that is the include tag. Now, this has nothing to do with the include function we used earlier in URLs py. It has nothing to do with that, just to make this clear. Instead, this now allows us to include another template. And here we then want to specify that template name or a relative path to the template. So here I can use header HTML, but that would not work because Django would not find a file named header HTML in the root templates folder or in challenges templates, because there it sits in the nested challenges includes folder. So here we could add challenges includes, and it would be found, or a relative path relative from the file in which we're using it. So that could be /includes header HTML. That's the relative path to header HTML seen from the challenge HTML file. Now I'll go for that absolute path here, which Django will be able to evaluate, because then I can easily share and reuse that in any other templates in that app without having to worry if they're in some nested folder or not or anything like that. Now, if we save all files, what will happen is that if I visit an individual challenge, you have that all challenges header at the top now. And we can use that same snippet, that same include snippet in index HTML. As you already see, this also needs no closing tag. There is no end include because, well, this does just one thing, like the URL tag. It includes that snippet. Now with that, we also have the header on the index template here, and we are now reusing and sharing that snippet across these app-specific templates. And that is a nice feature to have. Now, one thing's missing though, and that is this path here. We of course want to again construct this dynamically, and therefore what I'll do is I'll go to URLs py in the challenges app and give this index path a name with the name keyword argument, and I'll name it index. And now that this has a name in header HTML, we can again use the URL tag and specify index here as a URL, so that the path, the link to that URL, is dynamically generated by Django. If we now save that and reload and go to a month, we can click on all challenges to be taken back to the all challenges page. And this now is, of course, a very useful feature. Now, as a side note, there also is another nice thing about this include feature, which we don't need here right now, but which is good to know. The included snippets here will have access to the same variables you have access to in the template where you include them. So for example, in challenge HTML, we got the month name variable, and that would also be available in that included template. Of course, the problem then would be that we also include that template in index HTML, and if we rely on month name in the included template, that would work for challenge HTML, but not for index HTML. So if I temporarily output month name here, what you'll see is that this produces nothing for all challenges, but actually does print the month name for the individual challenge. And that is very useful, the fact that you have access to those variables in the included snippets as well. This can come in handy from time to time. You can also pass in specific context, specific values for the included template. You do this with the with keyword here, and then you can set extra variables, which will be available inside of the included snippet, which are not available in the template which is including. So here we could, for example, say with active page equals challenge. And then for the index HTML file, we say with active page equals index. And then inside of the include, we could, for example, output active page here. And if I save that, you see challenge if I'm on the specific challenge page, but index if I'm there. It's not something we need here, but something you might need in other circumstances, for example, to highlight the active link, and therefore that's another neat feature, which I'll delete for now, but which you should be aware of. We're also going to use that later in the course in our projects. So for the moment, I'm going to get rid of that include specific context though. And that's the include feature, which together with all the other features you learned allows you to write powerful, dynamic HTML templates without having to put all that logic into your views py file. Instead, that file can stay lean, and you now have all that logic for outputting and rendering inside of your templates. Now, to fully conclude the templates for now, I want to come back to our 404 page. What if I enter an invalid month name here? At the moment, this shows us this month is not supported, and that's coming from the views py file, where we return this HTTP response not found response. Now, the problem here is that this is still a place where we have hard-coded HTML inside of our views file. And that's typically what we want to avoid, as you learned. Now, the thing is, if you are using HTTP response not found, you are responsible for producing the HTML content that should go in there. Now, you could, of course, use render to string again to convert a template here. And that's something I want to do here for a start. I will go to my root templates folder in the project and add a 404 HTML file. This should be my base template for 404 errors. Here, I will actually also extend. We can do that here as well. So I will extend my base HTML file. But then, as a page title, I'll say something went wrong. We could not find that page. And end that block here. Like this. Let me actually structure it like this to make it a bit easier to read. And here I need a closing quote. And then I also have my block for the content. And we also need to, of course, end this block. And in here, I'll say we could not find that page or something like that. Sorry, but we could not find a matching page. So that's now my 404 template based on the base HTML file with some 404 specific content. Now I want to return this HTML file if we have a 404 error. Now we can use render to string as I mentioned. For this we again need to import Django template loader and from there import render to string. And then with that imported, here we can render the 404 HTML file to string. We don't need to specify anything else here because it's in the root templates folder, which we have added to our template dirs. And that gives us our response data, which we now can add to the HTTP response not found response, like this. And with that, if we save this and I reload, I see my 404 template. This works. We can't use the render shortcut function here though, because that always renders a success response. And we also want to send the 404 status code along with the response. You can see it in the browser developer tools. If you go to the network tab, here if you reload, you see that has that 404 response status code, which we should send along with the response to have a technically correct and, correctly classified response. So therefore, using render, the render shortcut won't work here. Of course, this approach works, but since this is such a standard case that you want to send back a specific 404 page for 404 errors, Django has another shortcut we can use here. Instead of importing render to string, from Django HTTP, we can import, instead of HTTP response, which we don't need anymore in this file, HTTP 404. That's another class we can import from Django HTTP. And I removed HTTP response because we're not using that anymore anywhere in this file. Now, HTTP 404 is now not a response which you create like this and which you return. Instead, what that is it's a class that you raise as an error. So here you would raise HTTP 404 like this. And you can then pass an error message to that if you want to. Now, what this will do automatically, because it's built into Django, is it will look for a 404 HTML file in your templates folders. So you should place such a file in your root templates folder then. It also has to be named 404 HTML for Django to find it, because it will look for specifically that file. With that though, if you save this and reload, you get this page here during development, because there the debug equals true setting is set. But as you see down there, if we would set this to false in our settings, we would see our standard 404 page. And we can briefly check this by going to settings py. And there we have this debug setting, which is set to true. Now we can't set it to false here because then our development server won't work anymore. But we would set this to false when we deploy our application, something I'll show you later in the course, of course. And if that is set to false, instead of that debug page, which you see to get extra information, you would see that 404 template we set up. So that's another way of returning that 404 template, and that is maybe the better way, because you then don't have to render that 404 template to a string all the time. Instead, you just raise that error, and Django will automatically return that 404 HTML file for you. So now I'll set debug back to true though, so that I can restart my development server again, because as mentioned, this does not work with debug set to false. And that's now it for templates for the moment. We covered all the important cases now which you will encounter in your web applications and your websites, and therefore, as a next step, I instead want to focus on making this a bit more pretty and adding CSS and therefore adding static files. Our dummy application here is definitely missing some styling. This is totally ugly, and it's finally time to change this. Now, we do change styling by adding CSS, and we typically add CSS not by adding CSS tags in our HTML documents, though we could do that, but we typically add CSS files that hold our CSS code. Just as we might add JavaScript files for JavaScript logic or image files for adding images. But here it's about CSS. So all these files, CSS, JavaScript, images, are called static files because they don't change. Our templates here do change. They do have dynamic logic inside of them. We inject variables, we have if statements, we have loops. All of that is dynamic. Now, the CSS code we write, that's the same code all the time. It's served in the same way all the time. It's not manipulated or edited by the server. And that's why it's called static. It does not change. Having such static files is quite common, and therefore the only question now is, where do we store those files? Well, for a start, we can start with some app-specific static files. So styles specific for our challenges app, which is part of this overall project. In there, we can add a new folder next to the templates folder, not inside of it, but next to it, which should be called static. And in there, just as with the templates folder, we want to add another subfolder which repeats our app name, challenges. So it's the same structure as with the templates, just with static as a top folder. And in there, we could now add our CSS file. For example, the challenges.css file, but the file name is up to you. In there, we could now, for example, target the unordered list and set the list style to none for a start. We're going to add more stylings later. I just want to start with one so that we can see whether that has an effect or not. How do we now utilize those static files? Well, that includes a couple of steps. First of all, we should go to the settings py file, and in there, you must make sure that in installed apps you have this Django contrib static files app. That should be there by default, and you shouldn't delete anything from there anyways, but double check that it is there. This is required for Django to load the functionality it needs to handle your static files. As a next step, you should scroll down, and somewhere you should have that static URL variable here, that static URL setting. This setting might look like it actually tells Django that it should look for static files in folders named static, but actually this setting does not fulfill this purpose or does not have this purpose. This setting instead is simply telling Django under which URL it should serve those static assets, and for the moment, that's not too important. This will become more important later once we deploy our application, but I'll talk about this setting in greater detail later in the course therefore, specifically when this becomes important and when we do need to change it maybe for deployment as mentioned. Instead, by default, Django will already look for folders named static in your app folders. So in your project, it will look into the app folders and look for static files there, and it'll automatically detect those and include those. So that's very convenient. You don't need to make Django aware of that. Here, it's set to /static/, that's the default, and that's fine. With that, we can now go to the templates where we want to use that CSS code. We can start with index.html, and then add another tag below the extends tag and add the load tag, another tag which is built into Django. And then simply load static. Now this is not between quotes, it's just written like this. This basically loads, you could say, a plugin, some extra functionality which is now exposed in this template. You can also write your own loadable plugins, but that's beyond the course scope for now. And the static loadable plugin, so to say, is the most important plugin you need from the built-in plugins, I would say. And you need to run this in order to use static files in this template. But how do we then use those static files? Well, in case of the CSS file, we in the end want to add a link element. This typically looks something like this. Link rel equals style sheet, ref equals, and then the path to the CSS document, the CSS style sheet file. Now, this should be added, but of course, since we're in a template extending another template, we want to add that in one of the blocks, and neither the page title nor the content block is great for this. So I will go to base HTML, and here in the head section, which is where you should add those links, I'll add a new block, and I'll name this block CSS files. Of course, that name is up to you. And I'll also end that block here. And now that block is there for us to inject CSS files from other templates which inherit from this template. So back in index.html, now I want to wrap this here with block CSS files. So with this new block I just added to the base template, and also add end block. And now this gets added into this base HTML structure into our base template. But what about this link? How do we now construct this link to the CSS file? Well, because we loaded static here, we can now use another tag here, which is kind of built in, but unlike the other tags, not available by default in our templates. Instead, it's only available once we load static. And that is the static tag. We can now use that thanks to load static. Static is a bit like the URL tag. It allows us to construct a path to a static asset, so to a CSS file, for example. And for that, we now need to specify the path, and that should be between quotes. And here it's challenges/challenges.css. It's this path because we have that challenges subfolder in the static folder. And we have this subfolder which repeats our app name for the same reason as we had it for our templates, so that we don't have any name clashes if we have the same static file name in different apps of our project. Now, with that, Django will construct a path to this static file for us, and it will serve that static file for us, and therefore this file should be imported and the style should be applied. Hence, if we now save all files and reload, actually nothing changes. And instead here we see we got a 404 error when the browser tried to request this challenges CSS file. It also proves, though, that this path was constructed. It points at /static/challenges CSS. But why is this failing now? Well, you simply need to restart your development server. So quit it with Ctrl+C and then restart it with Python 3 manage py run server. And if you then reload, you see now the bullet points here disappear. And now if you have a look at the network tab in the browser developer tools, you see the CSS file is loaded correctly. So that is now working as it should. But that's also a CSS file which is pretty specific to that list of challenges here. How would we add a general CSS file that should affect the entire application? For project-wide static files, we can use a similar approach as we did with project-wide templates. We can add a new folder called static next to our root templates folder. So this is side by side to the challenges app folder and the monthly challenges project configuration folder. There I have this new root static folder. And in there, we could now set up a general base CSS file or styles CSS file, whatever you want. And here we could set up project-wide CSS styles, or at least that would be a file that can be used easily from anywhere in the entire project. So from inside any template in the entire project, no matter in which app that template resides, or if it's a global template. Here, for example, I want to pick a specific font. And for that, I'm on fonts.google.com, where you can get some free fonts. And you can choose any font you like, any look you like. I think I will go with Roboto Condensed here, click on it, and select this regular 400 style, and also select the bold 700 style. Then we can use this import code, which is shown to us here, and copy that, go back to our page, and paste that here at the top of our styled CSS file. This will make sure that these Google fonts are being imported. Then we can add a HTML selector maybe, and set the font family to, what we also see here, Roboto Condensed Sans Serif. We can actually copy that snippet here and use that in here. We can also select the body tag maybe and remove the default margin, which this has in many browsers. With that, we can now use that global static file. We could use it in our challenges app in one of the templates there, but I want to use it in my root base HTML template. There, I want to add a link in front of that block where I then have the template-specific CSS files which are being injected. You can merge that. You can have specific CSS files from the inheriting templates which are being injected, and then have some general CSS files which are always loaded, and that's what I'm doing here. And I'll set the link rel style sheet here, and set ref to my style CSS file. For this, again, we need to load static here. We need to load this static plugin, so to say, so that down there we can use the now available static tag. And then here it's styles CSS, which I want to refer to. And now Django will look for such a styles CSS file to include it. The problem we'll face with that, though, is that if I save that and I reload my page, the text hasn't really changed. And instead we again got a 404 error when Django tried to find that file. Now with this global static folder, we'll have a problem, because Django does look for static folders and the files in there by default for your apps. So for your project, it will look into the app folders and automatically look for a static folder in there and then grab the files from in there. The problem is it does not look for such a static folder on a global level in your main project, on the root level of your project. It does not look for a static folder there. So to make Django aware of this folder, we need to do something similar to what we did with the templates. We need to add a special setting to our settings.py file to tell Django to pick up that static folder and look into that folder as well. And there are settings which you can add to settings.py which are not set up by default. Of course, you can check out the official settings config to find out about all possible settings. You rarely need to do that you add a new setting, but here we do need to add a new one. And that's the static files DIRs setting. It's a bit like the DIRs setting from our templates. There we also were able to specify specific template folders in our project that should be considered by Django. And we're now doing the same with static files. With static files DIRs, and make sure you have no typo in there, you can specify folders that should be considered when Django collects and loads static files. and when it then moves them behind the scenes to some global static folder on the server it creates. Here we again can use base_static to now tell Django that this static folder here in our root project directory should be considered as well as the app-specific folders. Those are considered automatically. With that, if we save that and reload, now this looks better. Now that text changed. It's still not super pretty because there's more we should style, but it is a start. Now, in the next lecture, I will work only on CSS. I will make sure that this overall looks nicer, also on the individual challenge pages. If you're not interested in that, if you don't care about CSS, you can also skip the next lecture and just use the finished CSS code for both the styled CSS as well as the app-specific CSS files, which you find attached to the next lecture. Otherwise, I'll see you there and we're going to write some CSS code together. So let's now work on making this all look a bit nicer. For that, I'll start with that list, because we already have an app-specific static file for that, the challenges CSS file, which we include in the index HTML template. Here I'm already targeting the list and I'm changing the list style, but of course that's not all I want to do. Instead, I also want to give this some margin of 2 rem auto to center it horizontally, and I'll not explain too much about the CSS code here. If you want to learn all about CSS, we got a dedicated course on that, and of course there also are plenty of free resources out there. I want to write that code together with you so that you see how it is created, but I definitely don't want to turn this into a CSS course. That's just a side note. So here we have that margin, and we maybe then give this a width of 90% and a max width of, let's say, 50 rem. And I also want to give this a box shadow of 0, 2 pixels, 8 pixels, RGBA like this to give it a light drop shadow. Add a little bit of padding of 1 rem and set a border radius of 12 pixels to give this some rounded corners. With that, if we save this and reload, that's what we get here. And I'll zoom out a bit so that this is a bit easier to see. Actually, I'll set the max width to 20 rem here, I guess. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. Now for the list items, I also want to change the style. So I'll select the list item elements here by tag, and I'll give them a margin of 1 rem top and bottom and 0 left and right. I'll set text alignment to center to, well, center the text. And I'll set the font size to, let's say, 2 rem. And if we save that, that's what we get. Well, maybe that's a bit too big. Let's go with 1.5 rem here. Reload, and also zoom out a bit because I'm still zoomed in quite a bit. Now I also want to have a little border below every item. So I'll add a border bottom here of, let's say, 1 pixel solid and a light gray. Like this. But there should be some spacing as well. So I'll also add a little bit of padding to the bottom of, let's say, 1 rem. Yeah, so that this looks a bit nicer. And I also don't want to have a border after the last item. So I will select the list item, the last of that type. And there I'll set border bottom to none, so that the last list item does not have a border at the bottom. With that, if I reload, that bottom border here is gone, and it's still there for the other items. Maybe it would also be nice to have 2 columns here, so that this is not one long column, but 2 columns side by side. And for that, on the unordered list, we can set the display here to flex and set the flex direction to column. And set flex wrap to allow wrapping. And then give this a height of, let's say, 20 rem. If I now save this, we got a bunch of columns here. And maybe 20 RAM is not enough, so let's go for 35 maybe? Something like this, yeah. Actually, let's maybe go with 30 RAM. But that's fine-tuning, which will depend on the screen size and so on anyways. Now, we do have that border at the bottom below June here, and that's a bit tricky to get rid of because this line break is not always at the same item here. But we can cheat a little bit, and under the assumption that it is after the 6th item, we can also select the nth item of that type and use the 6th one here besides the last item to remove the border at the bottom so that this is missing there as well. Okay, so that's my list here. Now, regarding the text in the list items, I don't like the blue color. I don't want them to be underlined. So I will select the anchor tags inside of the list items here and set the text decoration to none to remove that underlining, and set the color maybe to a grayish color, something like this maybe. Yeah, gray color like that. How does this look like? That's not too bad, I guess. And it would, of course, also be nice if we could hover over these items and we get some visual feedback then. So I want to add a hover and an active style to my anchor tags inside of the list items. And there I'll then set the color to purple, or at least I want to use that as a base color and use like such a plum color here, I guess. Change that to hex code. Maybe like this. Yeah, I think that's actually not too bad. We have a light highlight when we hover over these items. Now that is the list. I also want to change my general application-wide styles. And for example, I want to give the body a dark background. So for this here, I want to set the background color of the entire page to black, or not to black, but to a very dark gray, like this, so that we have dark mode by default. And then back in challenges CSS, I actually want to go to the unordered list and give this a background color of white or a very light gray, something like this. So that if I reload now, we have that dark background and that brighter list here. Now, I also, of course, want to style the header. The header here is one of our includes, and therefore I will also add a separate CSS file here. Technically, you don't have to, but I think it makes it easier to then quickly locate styles that belong to different HTML files. And hence, I'll even add includes here as a subfolder, header CSS. That's technically not required, it just makes it easier to then find the CSS files that belong to your include HTML files. In there, I want to select a header, and here I then want to give this, let's say, a width of 100% and a height of 5 rem maybe. Give it a background color of, I want to take that dark color here from the body and set that here, but then use a little bit of a lighter gray maybe. Let's see if that works out. And I also want to style my nav in there, in the header, and want to use the entire width here and use the entire height maybe, and add display flex here to use flexbox to center the items in the nav bar, to use justify content center and align items center. Now, as a side note, because that's important, all those CSS styles are global. I'm splitting them across multiple files, but just because I have a header CSS file here and a header HTML file does not mean that these CSS styles in there would only affect this header HTML file. They would affect any HTML elements anywhere on the page if they match these selectors. If you want to scope styles, you need to use ID or class selectors as you're used to. So there's nothing special regarding the behavior of CSS here when using them in Django projects. Now with that though, I got some basic header styles. Of course, I now want to include that header CSS file. And therefore, in header HTML, I want to make sure that this is loaded. But since header HTML is an include, which I use in other files, I think it makes more sense to include it in those other files. Like in index.html, I will quickly copy and paste my link, which I already have, and now also import challenges includes header CSS here in my CSS files block. And with that, if I reload, this is the header. And now, of course, we also want to change the header text. And therefore, in my header nav, I want to target my anchor tags and set the color to white maybe, set the font size to 2 rem, and the font weight to bold. And I then also want to set up specific hover and active pseudo selectors here, and then change the color maybe to that same plum color I used before. Let's see if that looks good. So I'll use this color here again. Save that and reload, and now we got all challenges. And I think that's a bit too dark, so I should use a more pinkish color here maybe. And I also want to get rid of the text decoration, so I'll set that to none so that this is not underlined. But with that, this doesn't look too bad. Now we can always go back to all challenges, and this has this styling. Now let's work on the individual challenge page. Of course, the header styles are missing there because we're only adding them in index.html with that link I just added, not in challenge.html, which is responsible for this page, and the rest of this page doesn't look great either. So let's work on this now. And for this, I'll copy this CSS files block from index.html to challenge.html to include the header CSS, and I'll include a new CSS file, which I have yet to add, and that's the challenge CSS file. Challenge CSS side by side to challenges. We could also rename challenges CSS to index CSS actually if we wanted to, but I'll not do it here. But we could do that to be in line with the template to which it belongs. But I'll stick to that file which I originally chose. Now we got challenge CSS here though. And with that, I want to style the h1 tag here, the h2 tag, and the paragraph fallback text. So let's start with the h1 tag. Here, I definitely want to have a big font size, maybe 3 rem, and I want to set the font weight to bold. And if I save that and reload, that looks wrong. And it of course does so because I'm using static, the static tag, without loading static. We always need to do that. So we need to load static here in order to use the static tag. And with that, that works. We're, by the way, getting that 404 error because we catch any errors in our view and always return the 404 page in case of errors. But now that's working. Now for the challenge, back here in challenge CSS, I want to align that h1 tag in the center. And for the h2 tag, which holds the actual challenge text, I also want to align that in the center. And actually, I think I will shrink the h1 tag to 1.5 rem and instead emphasize the h2 tag. So give that a font size of 3 rem and make it bold. And also both should have a color of white. And since I have quite some duplication here, we can therefore actually also create like a shared selector here where I select both. And I will outsource these shared styles into that shared selector and only have different selectors for the font sizes. And with that, that looks quite okay. Now the margins are not there where I want them. And I think I actually only want the h2 tag to be bold too. And then here I'll change the margin on h1 to 2 rem to the top, 0 to the right, 1 rem to the bottom, 0 to the left. and save that. And this looks better. I mean, for H1, I'll set the font weight to normal explicitly so that the browser default of being bold doesn't kick in. And we might also want to give this here some color so that we add a little color here, and we maybe use that pinkish color we had in the header for this as well. Yeah, I think that's okay. And I think that's good for now. After all, this is no CSS course, and it now definitely looks much better than it did before. Now, what about that fallback text here, like in December, for example? I, of course, also want to style this, and my fallback text is just a paragraph here. So in Challenge CSS, I'll select that paragraph. Since the fallback text is the only paragraph I'll ever have here, I can use the paragraph selector like this. In reality, we will probably have more paragraphs on other pages as well, so we might want to use a CSS class instead, even though we technically don't need to here. But here I will do that and add a class of fallback to this paragraph, and then with that, set my fallback text here, or my fallback class here for this fallback text, and set the styles here then as I want them to be set. For example, set text align to center, give this a color of white, save all files, and reload, and that's quite okay. I don't want to make that super big. A little fallback text like this looks fine to me. Now, of course, feel free to fine-tune this styling more, to adjust the styles as you want them to, and to add your favorite styles, but I think that's decent. And we now therefore finished the look of this first dummy project here, this challenges project. So in the last lecture, we styled this, and we used our knowledge about static files to include CSS and set styles as we want to. And if you skipped that lecture, as mentioned, attached to the last lecture, you find a snapshot with all those CSS files. And as one note, you just want to make sure that in your challenge HTML file, you add this fallback class to this paragraph. Otherwise, this will not be styled correctly for months where it's being shown. Now, as I mentioned in the last lecture, you can of course adjust the styles however you want. This is not a CSS course, so I did not spend hours on that. I just want to have some basic styling here also so that we can see how static files work. And with that, we're at the end of this module. We learned about the very important feature of templates. We learned that templates allow us to define HTML documents with dynamic content, where the content is then set dynamically by Django based on data we generate in our views, which we then pass into our templates with the render function, for example. This context which we pass into our templates can then be used in there. For example, with this interpolation syntax to output and render a value in the HTML document. We can also use filters, optionally, if we want to adjust the look or the formatting of certain values. Now, besides interpolation, we also have tags. For example, the for tag for repeating content and rendering a list of content based on some data. We also have the if tag to render content conditionally. And then we have this important feature of template inheritance, where we define a base template, or multiple base templates if we want to, with some blocks reserved in them, which will be replaced, or which can be replaced by the inheriting templates. And we then do inherit by using the extends tag and pointing at the base template, the base HTML file we want to inherit from, though that doesn't have to be named base HTML as you learned. And then we insert those blocks here as well in the inheriting template to inject content into that base template, so that we use the base template as a skeleton which we enrich with the specific content we need for this specific template. And we can inject anything, just some text, some HTML tags, or also some static file imports as we're doing it here. Speaking of static files, we also learned how to work with those, that we need to load this feature, but then we can let Django construct these static paths, these static URLs, to include static files like CSS files, images, or JavaScript. Here we're only using CSS, but it would work in the same way for those other asset types as well. We just need to make sure that we store our files in the correct folders, like the static folder in our app folder, and that we have set up the settings py file correctly. For example, for a global static folder, we needed to add that static files dirs list here. For templates earlier, we also had a look at this settings file, and we, for example, made sure that the global templates folder is also included with that dirs setting here. Application template folders are automatically included. Now, for placing our templates, we used this best practice structure of repeating the app name in the app-specific templates folder to avoid name clashes. We're doing the same for static files. And we also learned about the feature of including template files to include snippets into other templates. Another nice feature which helps us with reusing code and avoiding code duplication. The overall goal with that is to keep our views py file lean and to really focus on the logic for extracting and getting and transforming data here, and not on formatting and constructing HTML code. That's the task of the template, and with the knowledge you got in this course section, you are ready to use templates and static files in your own projects as well.